Hello and welcome once again. This is our second class on Frederick Myers' work of 1903 called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. I'm Mark Ryan, and a number of our participants are off in Tibet right now. Jim won't be with us for that reason, and I think some of the great books regulars may be with him. But we want to look now with a little more depth into this work. And let me begin with a bit of a review of what we said 3 weeks ago now, so we'll all have it fresh in our minds. Our broader subject, you remember, was really the nature of consciousness itself. And we credited the guy you see in front of you, Frederick Myers, as the first figure in modern psychology to provide a comprehensive theory of the unconscious, a map of what he called the subliminal mind. And we observed that it was a far more expansive map, more spiritually oriented than the Freudian picture that emerged a few years later and that came to dominate 20th century depth psychology. Freud was part of a clinical tradition, primarily investigating the role of the unconscious in mental pathology. He was looking at pretty sick people. Myers, on the other hand, was fascinated with the supernormal and paranormal, with evidence that the mind had a far greater reach capacity than normally penetrated our everyday awareness. You remember that Myers said that the unconscious encompassed both a rubbish heap and a treasure house. We might say that the clinical investigators, Freud included, looked more at the rubbish heap, while Myers looked at the treasure house. His research focused on such experiences as telepathy, clairvoyance, automatic writing, when someone's writing and barely conscious of what is coming out, precognition, knowing things in advance, inspirations of genius, visions, and trances, what comes out in trance states. And as a consequence, Myers portrayed an unconscious with far greater potential than Freud did. One that could extend into collective dimensions beyond the experience of our personal egos, into realms we all share, and beyond that, into an awareness of a spiritual context that envelops and informs our lives, culminating ultimately in mystical insight. Potentially, the unconscious opens up to what Myers called a wisdom profounder than we know, wiser than our sanity itself. So in that sense, Myers was groping towards a view of the mind that had much in common, really, with that Tibetan view that we glimpsed at in the previous 2 months in our readings of Lama Govinda. For Myers, we are essentially a spirit controlling an organism, as opposed to electrochemical neuron systems that somehow give rise to consciousness. He was interested in evidence that undermined the common Western materialistic assumption, scientistic is the term we use, that all consciousness arises out of sense experience passed through a material brain. Instead, the brain could be seen as interacting with, rather than producing consciousness, and as selecting, and this is important, as selecting from a very restricted band of the much wider consciousness that's potentially available to us. You remember that Myers compared consciousness to a spectrum of light rays. Just as the human mind sees only a small band of the wide range of light rays that exist, in the same way, our common rational awareness focuses only on a small band of the realities that our subliminal minds can potentially perceive. Now, for Myers, the unconscious was a far greater component of who we are than the rational mind. Most others in psychology at the time saw the unconscious as kind of on the periphery of what we call consciousness. But for Myers, it was central. It was far greater. It was much bigger than what we carried in our everyday awareness. And in that conviction, making consciousness primary over the rational, Myers's model that he advanced here, as William James said, quite overturns the classical notion of what the human mind consists in. So this is really a revolutionary book at its time. At the same time, Myers was a passionate believer in the methods of modern science. He wanted to explore as exactingly, as empirically as possible, the experiences that lay beyond that narrow band of rational awareness. And that's what he proceeds to do in this book. So Dan, let's go to that slide with the table of contents now. So his method, we said this last month too, was to establish as best he could the empirical evidence for the more common experiences. First, the ones that most of us acknowledge exist. And then to proceed step by step to present evidence that excuse me just a moment. Sorry, my dog somehow got in. So he would present evidence of, first of all, what most people acknowledge exists, and then step by step to proceed to present evidence that were more challenging to the common paradigm. And he does that within each of these chapters that you see in front of you, as well as with the structure of the book as a whole. Now, for those of you who were with us last week, I asked you to reflect on any experiences that you yourself or anyone you might know have had comparable to some of the accounts given here. And I don't know how thoroughly you've had a chance to read this abridged version. I did speak with one person who didn't see the word abridged in our instructions and bought volume 1 of what's a tome of 3,000 pages or something like that. So, but we'll give an account of it. So in the introduction, this first chapter here, he sketches his approach and refers to the importance of telepathy. Now you remember, that's a term that Myers himself coined. Here in this chapter, he defines it as the transference of ideas and sensations from one mind to another without the agency of recognized organs of sense. So it's not going through the channels that the materialist view assumes it must. Now for him, that was monumental. And he states that it's his task in this book to demonstrate the far-reaching implications of this empirical evidence for telepathy and associated phenomena. It argues, he says, for an incalculable extension of our mental powers. So, if we can do that, if we can have communication from mind to mind without going through the senses, this opens up a whole new world of what the mind is capable of. Eventually, Myers comes to the conclusion that the facts of things like telepathy, clairvoyance, of knowing things from a distance, that those things argue for the existence of a spirit independent of the body. That's how he conceived of it. He called telepathy the Rubicon between the material and spiritual conceptions of reality, meaning an irreversible crossing. In any case, whether it's that or not, these facts are inexplicable by the materialist position that all information is processed directly by the five senses. So let's begin there. And let me just ask if any of you have had experiences of what you consider telepathy, a direct experience of something telepathic in your own lives, or have you witnessed it in those you know well? And Dan, let me just, we have a small call today. I think they're just a few of us, but let me ask if any of you have any thoughts about that. Dave, I see Dave Macquarie has come up there. Although I think you're on mute, Dave. There you're not.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I've been a psychotherapist for 25 years, and I've had such a wide range of experiences that I have absolutely no doubt as to the reality of mind as distinct from the materialistic world. In particular, with your question, I worked with a guy by the name of Joe Schaefer, who would have us sit in dyads and at some level just wait for communication to occur without any verbal contact. And I was surprised as to how frequently one person would be able to describe the experience of another person.
Mm-hmm.
So again, not anecdotal,
mm-hmm.
And not well documented, but such that it really was one of the aspects that convinced me of the nature of mind.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Dave. Let me give you a couple of instances in my life, and maybe this will prompt some thoughts of others. This first one was I was in my early 20s and admittedly in a non-ordinary state of consciousness with my partner, my wife at the time. And we were in a conversation. And I really don't consider myself particularly talented at these things. I'm a fairly rational dude, right? But we were in a conversation, and then we stopped talking with one another. And then I heard her say a particular phrase. I can't repeat the phrase anymore. But I realized as I heard that she was not, her mouth wasn't moving. She was not speaking. And I said, "Did you just say?" And repeated the phrase. And she said, "Yes, but I didn't speak it." And now that's a small little incident, but it was something that seemed, to me, I guess my most powerful firsthand experience of something that I would call telepathy. My wife Ginger has actually a much more interesting story. She worked for many years with autistic people. And these were people who were entirely nonverbal. They didn't talk. And one of the people working with them got the idea that maybe let me back up a bit. They started to work with a new technique at the time called facilitated communication. And it used a keyboard like we have on a computer. But the autistic people, most of the establishment world assumed that there was nothing going on in their minds because they couldn't speak. And but using this technique, they realized that these people who had spent these were young adults at the time, had spent their entire life in silence, could actually read and write. And they could type words. They needed help for the arm to be held, because otherwise they would tend to just perseverate on a letter. So they needed to be pulled off of it. But very laboriously, they could type things showing that they had picked up a capacity to read and write. Okay, well, the story gets more interesting. So the people who worked with them got the idea that maybe these people could have a conversation circle. And they brought these little typing machines into a group of about 6 or 8 people. And in one of them, as the conversation started, one asked another, typing, "How was your party this weekend?" Reasonable question, but the workers said, "Wait a minute. How did you know that he was going to be going to a party?" Because these people lived apart, and the workers knew that they hadn't had this kind of communication with one another since the idea of the party took shape. And so then they asked the question, "Well, how did you know that?" And they said, "Oh, well, we just communicate." and then they said, "Well, then why are we using these typing machines?" And the autistic people said, or one of them said, "Oh, well, that's for you, so you'll know." Well, this was in absolute contradiction to the scientific model of what autism was at the time. And, you know, that story has stuck with me, and it's begun to make some headway in the more established quarters, I think, of child psychology studies, but far from accepted in the mainstream. So let's go back to that slide on the table of contents, okay? Now, in the next two chapters, Disintegrations of Personality and Genius, Myers is looking at cases that are broadly acknowledged. In the first instance, multiple personalities, and the psychological community knew about that. And in the second, flights of inspiration. He's interested in how these cases indicate a reach of consciousness beyond what the ordinary personality could know, hidden in the personal subconscious, or perhaps from beyond that. Now, in some multiple personalities, the knowledge exhibited turned clairvoyant. So you have these people who, in their secondary personalities, would know things that they couldn't otherwise possibly know. For example, he refers to the Brooklyn Enigma, who was a woman who was blinded in a fall, but it was claimed afterwards that she could read sealed letters and find lost articles and describe events at a distance. So to Myers, cases like that indicated that there was a great reserve of untapped faculties that all of us might possess. And the same was true with genius. Genius was what he sees as an uprush from the subliminal to the unconscious mind. So it wasn't, I think as we said last time, it wasn't that these people are just so much more rationally smart than you and I are, but they have a thin veil between the unconscious that picks up all of this perception and their regular superliminal, as Meyer put it, mind, producing, for example, full works of art full-blown, which the artist just feels himself as recording. So then the next two chapters I'd like to see if we have any stories on, and they have to do with sleep. Really, we can, what Myers is talking about here is dreams and hypnotism. Now, Myers suggests that there are many, many instances of distant visitations, premonitions, clairvoyance, and telepathy coming through dreams. And hypnotism was their technique at the time for intentionally producing something akin to what he thought was akin to this sleep dream state that could work in the same way. So they also where people work in the same way, in the sense that people would have these perceptions that were not ordinarily available to their rational minds. So let me ask whether any of you think of experiences through dreams or hypnotism where something out of the ordinary seemed to be going on in terms of your perceptions. And I mentioned hypnotism in part with Victoria in mind, because I know that she's worked with hypnotism to some degree, but I don't know the extent of it or whether it would be applicable in this discussion. But I invite any of you to chime in if you've had experiences with dreams or hypnotism that seemed out of the ordinary and indicating a greater capacity to the mind. Hi, Victoria, there you are. Ah, there you go.
Now I'm unmuted.
There you are. Hello there.
Yes, I have used hypnosis. I've been a psychotherapist since 1970. That began in the 60s. And it's about 32 years ago I was certified as a hypnotist. And I have worked with multiple personalities over the years and dissociation. And it is rather remarkable. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. I'm riveted.
Many years ago, I interestingly worked with two different multiple personalities, people who had multiple personalities, and for some years, one for 10 years actually. And when that person called me on the phone to ask for an appointment, I knew exactly what it was going to be, which was interesting as well, that there had been incest, and that I could sort of see in my mind what the problem was before they told me. And doesn't happen very often, but I do tend to know when people are about to call me, etc. But it is very true that one through hypnosis can reach into people's personalities that they have formed to be able to deal with trauma through their lives. They tend to be very intelligent people who, as children, found this way of being to be able to handle what turned out to be very difficult trauma in their lives.
So the most extraordinary thing if we're thinking in terms of this model of the psyche that has a lot more capacity than we know, what's most struck you is your own intuitions about cases that have come forward among your clients, right?
Yes. Yes. It was very interesting to me. In fact, I saw the woman who was Eve, heard her speak, who was Three Faces of Eve, and I went to New York to speak with Dr. Flora Schreiber, who had written that. She also wrote another book about another person who had multiple personalities. So for years, I was very interested in this phenomenon. And in fact, the person whom I saw for 10 years, and I wrote wonderful, we did a lot of artwork, but she had journals, and we had a whole trunk full of those journals. And I thought, well, this will be interesting for posterity's sake. But at one point, when she had graduated, as it were, many years later, she wanted to destroy those. And so we did a ceremony and did so. And of course, there's a part of me that thinks, well, we really should have saved those. Yeah. But on the other hand, that was a very important thing for her to move on in her life. And she did so. But that's a whole nother story. These people whom I saw, and I saw one when I was on staff of a hospital in the early 70s for a period of time. But it is a very interesting phenomenon. There tends to be someone who is the watcher or the overseer of the different people who are involved. But it's an extensive story, extensive how I work with these people, and that's for another.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. Ben, I see Paul is trying to communicate with us, but I'm not sure how successfully. Do you know what's happening there? Paul says he has some observations to make on inspiration and genius. There you are. Hi, Paul.
Okay. Hello. Mark, you brushed over 2 and 3, disintegration of personality and genius.
Right.
I wanted to Okay, first of all, I make absolutely no claims to genius, but I have spent my career doing technical work. That is, working with physics and mathematics and stuff like that, in an engineering sense. And I have had a great many experiences with struggling with a problem where I've got data, I've got ideas of physics, and I'm trying to make sense of it. And I have found on a number of occasions that the answer just comes to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as though I have to work with it, and then it just comes to me. And I remember when I was in graduate school having that happen to me. I was working on a problem and had gone out running and was back at the gym, changing my shoes, taking off my shoes. And the answer just, bang, it hit me in the face. I mean, it hit me not in the face, in the body.
Uh-huh.
And I talked with a colleague of mine who was far more, much more of a mathematician and a physicist than me, who had studied such things. And he told me a story about a very famous mathematician who had gotten off a tram or a streetcar in Paris and had this whole system of very famous equations just come to him.
Wow.
And so what I wanted to say is that I think that within the scientific community, at least among some people in the scientific community, there is a recognition that inspiration comes.
Mm-hmm.
Inspiration comes from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, it's not something we create, or at least that's my view, is, the way I see it is that this is not something I created. It's something that I wrestled with. It's there, and then it came from, I guess, the subliminal.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Fascinating, Paul. I used to teach a course on the nuclear era. And my example of that, of a similar case, was Leo Szilard, who was the first person to realize that you could make an atomic bomb. And he was on a street corner, just about to cross the street, and he just saw it. There, I guess, a lot of stories like that, but it's wonderful to have them first and second hand like you've had. Thank you. Well, let me turn now to another kind of case. Were there anybody else I should check in with, Dan, who might want to talk about dreams, for example?
This is Paul. I have something about that I guess only falls later under phantasms of the dead. But
let's move to that. Let's move to that. And I'll give it a bit of an introduction here. So this is another kind of case which Myers and especially his colleague Richard Gurney documented really extensively, and which actually led them to their idea of telepathy. And that is a case. They call these cases crisis apparitions. Dan, can we come back to that table of contents slide, if we have that? They had looked at hallucinations, visions that just kind of spontaneously appear in the mind of persons or objects that are not physically present. And the psychological world had assumed that such hallucinations, seeing something that isn't there, is really the product of an illness or a malady. But Gurney and Myers observed that they also occurred among people who were entirely healthy, and sometimes, with some frequency, they were what they called veridical. That is, they reflected an actual physical occurrence in reality, even if it took place at a distance. And their book published prior to the one we're looking at, called Phantasms of the Living, documented cases in which someone suddenly perceived that a distant person whom they were close to personally was undergoing a major crisis. Usually, the crisis was death. And it turns out this is quite a common experience. I've raised this question in other contexts. We're a very small group today, but I find that everywhere I go and bring it up, people have had this kind of experiences in which they knew someone had died really at the moment of death. Gurney and Myers documented hundreds of these cases, not including simply firsthand anecdotes, but only ones that in which third parties witnessed the subject's reaction and witnessed that subject later found out that the actual death had taken place. So let me ask about that. Have you or someone you're close to seem to know when a loved one has died or undergone some major crisis? So that's my question. Okay, Paul, it looks like you're on.
Okay. My situation isn't quite exactly what you described, but basically in my, it was the year I turned 20, I had a family friend as a youth that I did babysitting for their kids, and a few years later, I was working in Long Beach, lived for the summer near where they lived, and the woman who I was close to had brain cancer and died that summer. And the family went on a 2 or 3 week trip and asked me to stay in their house. And I can remember very, very vividly one night her presence in that room, in the room with me.
Oh.
And what I want to make clear here is at that age, I was perhaps a super rational, logical individual. I was, caught up in math and physics and the physical world. I really liked, my spiritual connection was going out into the mountains by myself, and I was connected that way. But in terms of the mystical sorts of things that we talked about last month, in the last couple of months, there was something there, but I was not aware of any of that. And so here was this rational, logical engineer who was feeling the presence of this being that I had known, and it was a benign, it was just a presence. There weren't any messages. She had died maybe a week or two before that. So, I just that was my experience of this kind of thing.
What exactly, can you describe what exactly you felt?
Just a presence.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if the word, I don't know that we would have used the word term psychic at that. It was just a presence. It was just there wasn't any emotion there, like any attempts to communicate. It was just, she was there. She was there with me.
Right. Thank you.
So,
Victoria, what do you have to report here?
Well, first of all, I wanted to say how extraordinary this book is and how extraordinary this man and his colleagues were to have explored the unconscious mind in so many positive ways before anyone else did. And the book to me is just remarkable. And I think it's opening all of us up to memories that we have had in the past. In particular, I wanted to say this. Now, I've had many dreams where I've talked to people who've died, and even when they've come back, these are other matters. But as far as a presence is concerned, when my very best friend, one of my dearest friends, died one afternoon, I was outside in an area of this county near a river where she always liked to visit. And I was in a car. I'm getting out of a car, and in the truck next to me, it was empty. She appeared. Now, I have never before or since seen someone who has died in an apparition. And there she was, and she'd been very sick.
And let me ask you, was this right about the moment of her death?
Yes, yes, it was that afternoon. I'm not sure exactly when, but she had just died, essentially, according to her children. And she smiled and she laughed and she communicated to me, and we were very close, psychically as well, through our relationship, that she was fine and that she was alive. And my mouth just flew open. I was speechless, of course. And then she disappeared. Isn't that wonderful?
That's incredible. Well, I say it's incredible, but it's interesting that we have a group of 4 students here, and 2 have things to report on these. I mean, it's astonishing how common this seems to be. Now I'll make a distinction here. You're giving us the more common thing, which is the crisis apparition, the moment of crisis. And that's where Myers begins his chapter on phantasms of the living. And the question is, well, how do you explain it? Now, that was when he came up with the notion of telepathy. So he didn't necessarily think that in most cases, and we'll talk about this in a bit, in most cases that meant that what you saw was the actual spirit. It could be that there's some kind of a telepathic communication, but what it activates in your mind is a vision of the person. So it's a little bit distinct from the ghost, right? Although Myers didn't dismiss the ghost either, but he was looking for explanations that could be somewhat more acceptable and plausible to scientifically oriented minds.
Well, this woman looked just like you or I standing there. Just not like a person. But she sat inside the truck as if to say, if I come right next to you, you might have a heart attack. So there she was right next to me in this vehicle, and just laughed and laughed. She was so happy.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
So that's so beautiful. But one issue comes up, which these folks had to discuss too. Was she wearing clothes?
Yes. Yes, she had on.
And what do you remember about the clothes?
She had on a dress that she often wore.
Okay, now that's an argument that it's something more telepathic, perhaps, because this is something that
it was a white dress.
You see, but the ghosts wear clothes. I mean, so
that we could not. It strikes me that for me, it felt like, well, I'll have something on so that you won't concentrate on the fact I have nothing on rather than what I need to convey to you.
Right. But it does carry us into the psychological complexities of this stuff.
Indeed.
And the more they dug into it, really in some ways, the more complicated it got. But let me turn to Paul's case now and say, Myers makes this same leap. He says, okay, we have Victoria's case, and we can give you hundreds and hundreds of those. And then he says, and people can. He gives you the explanation of telepathy, and so his readership can say, oh, all right, maybe there is something going on that's just a kind of very strong telepathic communication at the moment of death. That doesn't necessarily prove that there's spirits wafting around. Okay. But then he moves into questions about cases where the knowledge or the apparition seem to, as Paul experienced it, come after the person's death, or in which a communication seems to be coming, we'll call it a presence, as in Paul's case, not from the living, but from a deceased personality. In your case, we don't really know at the precise moment whether this person was, just, I mean, it sounds like it probably happened just after the moment of her death, but we can't really verify that, let's say. But in Paul's case, we're talking about a couple of weeks later. And most of the kinds of cases they could document about that, and they wouldn't document Paul's case because there's no third-party testimony, right? There's nobody that says that can assure us, sorry about that, that this is not something just going on in Paul's mind, right? Or there's no phenomenon that assures us of that as third-party observers. But so the other question I was going to raise, and I think we've already had it answered from Paul, is do you have any experience that you might see as the presence of someone right after death? I'll give one brief one of my own, and it's I can't say it's fully convincing, but my sister died this last summer, and I had been with her the day before when she was apparently not very conscious. But I told her at that time just how important her presence had been in my early formation. She's 10 years older than I. And she really kind of guided a lot about my early education that was formative. And I expressed my appreciation for that. And then it wasn't clear that she was just about to pass. We didn't know because this had been going on for a while. I went back to my hotel, and her daughter was with her. And then I got a call early the next morning saying that my sister just died. And so I came over, and I got there about half an hour after her death. And I was left alone with the body. And I sat down in a chair, and I often kind of carry a men's purse that I had by the chair. But I set it down right at the edge of the chair. I remember doing that. And then I just said to the body, really, I said, I don't know whether you could hear or perceive the things I was saying yesterday about how much your influence meant in my life. And I just heard this thump. It was just like a rap. It was. And I thought, maybe the purse had fallen off the chair onto the floor, but I looked over and it was right there where I had set it. So it was a rap. Now the interesting thing is that the whole spiritualism phenomenon got started with raps. So delve into my psyche. I knew that. Was this coming from something in my psyche that wanted assurance that she heard that, and because I'm aware that there was a rap or is a rap phenomenon, I heard a rap? Or in the spiritualist explanation, was it a rap that somehow spirits are capable of causing as an acknowledgement of my question? I certainly have had, I haven't had firsthand experiences of a crisis apparition at the moment of death, but I have had, one case comes to mind where I spent most of my career as a dean of students, and most of that at Yale University. And I had a student I was somewhat close to, and she was an actress, and she was very influenced by her own grandmother, who had been a singer at a time when this was seen as a scandalous profession among women. And Melissa was the name of the student, who was also an actress as well, a singer as well. And so she identified immensely with her grandmother. Her grandmother was in the stage of dying somehow, but nobody knew exactly when, and was in New York. We're in New Haven. Melissa goes and visits her grandmother in New York. Looks like she'll be with us for a few days. So Melissa comes back to New Haven. And she goes with her 3 roommates. So here's the veridical part, the witnesses. She goes with her 3 roommates to a play on the university campus. And during an intermission, all 3 testified to this. During an intermission, Melissa just says, "My grandmother just died." And she went out to the pay phone, it was at the time, phone home, in fact, that had just happened. That's the kind of story one hears a great deal. The ones after death are somewhat, perhaps, rarer. However, let's go back to our table of contents, Dan. Can you do that? And in this last chapter, the difference between sensory and motor automatism, I just explained briefly. Sensory means that when things are coming just into the mind. Motor is when it's some kind of a physical accompaniment. It might be automatic writing, in which someone is apparently communicating with a deceased person through writing that doesn't seem to pass through their conscious mind, or in which there are other physical phenomena like telekinesis, bent spoons, and that sort of thing. But his last chapter is on trance, possession, and ecstasy. And it's in that he ultimately gets into mystical experience and things of the sort. But what he was discussing here, and what he and his colleagues in the Society for Psycho Research were examining to a great extent, were trance mediums. Women, almost all women, not entirely, but mostly women, who would go into a trance state and then purport to communicate with the dead or with other entities who seem to just possess their spirits, a kind of channeling. Now, originally, the very sophisticated psychologists were fascinated by this phenomenon. And these were committed scientists, figures like William James, Carl Jung. Carl Jung wrote his doctoral dissertation on a trance medium, his cousin. And his mother was given to this sort of thing. And another man who looms large in this era and these studies is a Frenchman by the name of Théodore Flournoy. And they study these people to a great extent. I mean, we're talking about dozens and dozens, ultimately adding up to hundreds of sessions, very controlled, wondering what the hell's going on here. And originally, Myers attributed these phenomena, aspects of the medium's own personalities. That is, the medium had a kind of sub-personality within her subconscious that she would retreat into that would take on these other characteristics. But his studies eventually convinced him that at least in certain cases, other spiritual agencies were involved. The medium seemed to know information and exhibit traits that were known only to personalities with which they were purportedly communicating. So in the end, Myers believed that he had demonstrated both the expansive power of the subliminal self that we've been talking about all along here, which he saw as culminating in religious ecstasy and mystical insight. But he also thought that he had empirically demonstrated the agency, the activity of discarnate spirits. So what's then, in the end, the relationship between brain and mind, between matter and spirit? He says we are seeing a mind use a brain. The human brain is, in its last analysis, an arrangement of matter expressly adapted to being acted on by spirit. Now, we have another half hour, and I'd like to give you a little bit of a summary of how many of these investigators came down in the end on the question of had they demonstrated an afterlife, of the survival of personality. Myers was at one end of the spectrum. He thought he had, but it's a very interesting discussion going on among them. Before we get into that, I just want to ask if there's any other comments people have related to what we've been talking about so far, so I don't cut anybody off. Anybody particularly want to chime in with anything?
This is not exactly in line with the framework of what you've been talking about, but it does relate to the survival of human personality after bodily death. And I don't know how unusual my experience here is, but it has to do with some communications with my mother while she was dying. She was in hospice. She had chosen to stop eating. She was not in any pain. She was just letting go of life. And over about a 10-day period, it lasted a long time, my sister and I were with her, and then my sister had to leave. And we would sit with her. We wanted to be present with her. Like I said, we wanted to be present. And when I would sit next to her, you know, what I observed in her, I'm sorry, I'm not doing a very good job at this. I've never tried to describe it. Mm-hmm. What I observed over her last days was a gradual withdrawal from the world. Mm-hmm. And less communicating. And I remember maybe 2 days, maybe 3 days before she died, sitting next to her. She was in a like a hospital bed. It was a hospice bed, and I was holding her hand. And I had been paying attention to being present with her and holding her hand a lot. And I remember making a conscious choice to say, okay, I don't need to do this anymore. And I let go. And she said, thank you. Mm. And those were the first words she had probably spoken in 24 hours.
Wow. Uh-huh.
So, you know, that has stayed with me.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is what that communicated to me was, at least in her case, the process of dying was one of gradual withdrawal from the world, while at the same time maintaining full awareness, full presence, but getting further and further away from the physical world that you're leaving. And when your child, and we had a very close relationship, when your child sort of lets go, I mean, and let's go emotionally, if you will, metaphorically, let's go. You know, thank you. You know, there's nothing holding me back anymore.
Right.
So this isn't quite death, but it's part of the process leading up to death. And then, like I said,
it gives us, it gives us a sense that there's still a full presence there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Dan, I just saw that message in the Q&A from Emma saying that she can't seem to communicate with us. Do you know, we didn't have Emma on our list of attendees. Do you have any idea whether we can pull her in?
But it's great being here, certainly with everyone, and I really certainly appreciate the book. It's certainly a classic in the field. And as I'm listening to everyone, I'm just flashing back to so many experiences that I've had. I've been very involved in the psychic and spiritual fields for many years, and have actually taught many intro to parapsychology classes. And in that time, I have met so many different people with so many different experiences. So I think it was as Dave said at the very beginning, there's no doubt in his mind, and there's no doubt in my mind that not only that this exists, but also that as a scientist, we also need to research it further. So historically, the book is a classic. And certainly, even having classes like this is so important to have us all know that it's an important field of study, and then that is going to absolutely affect so many more than just those people that are here today. So thanks.
Emma, is there any single story that you might like to tell us that comes to mind?
Well, I guess since there are so many of us psychotherapists and other people that are looking at things from also the psychological, this story comes to mind. As a young child, to escape, if you will, being brought up in a home with just adults, I would go up to my grandmother's attic, and there was what I would call the big book. Later to find out it was some sort of a Bible. And I would look at the illuminated letters and just be there. And I know now that I was getting into an altered state of consciousness. Well, what would happen is it was like a wonderful big old library. And I would just very much relax and be myself and explore further. And the other people that were there in the attic with me also were very much wanting to learn about things. And so one day I made the mistake when my mother and grandmother asked me what I was doing and who I was with. I happened to say, oh, those people were there also. And that has become my almost MO in life, that I was told, no, you were there alone, and you were not experiencing anything or anyone. And so I then went on in my own studies to very much know that they were coming from a place of fear, and in later years did talk with them about their own experiences. But in those perhaps 10 to 20 years in between, got into psychology and became a psychotherapist myself, and worked with many people and did a lot of research in the area to come to the point, which to me is the most important, is that all of this is very natural. And when I teach this and when I experience this and when I talk with people, to know that this is just another part of ourselves, and I think that's what Myers is and the other researchers are trying to show us and get some quantitative data, but they're trying to show us that this is very natural, it does exist, and it's really important to continue to grow with it. So that's a little bit about my history, if you will.
Oh, well, thank you. Yes, and that, that phrase, just another part of yourself, is very telling and exactly of ourselves, exactly what Myers was trying to establish. Well, let me just talk a little bit about how this whole research community at this time comes out about afterlife questions. We mentioned the medium Leonora Piper. She was the one they studied most extensively. And people like her would have visions and seem to embody even returning spirits who would give them uncannily accurate information about the lives of others, the dead, who information that they apparently could not know through ordinary sense experience. Now, Myers first provided a theory that showed that information as coming through the subliminal mind, often through a secondary personality. They called them the controls, a secondary personality that the subliminal somehow encompassed, okay? But then the question is, what was the source of that? Now, for most spiritualists, the visions were exactly what they were tended to be. They were ghosts. They were surviving personalities visiting from another realm, bringing information that they were privy to, but that the mediums in their ordinary state of mind couldn't know. But others of the psychological investigators they didn't seem to accept that so easily. So they looked for a source within the medium herself. Flournoy, whom I mentioned, the Frenchman, who was a major influence, by the way, on Carl Jung, coined the term cryptomnesia, and that is hidden memories, which were perceptions absorbed through an unconscious mind and then just kind of forgotten, or perhaps it never came into rational awareness. And such memories never surfaced in the medium's ordinary consciousness, but in these trance states, they could be reasserted through secondary personalities that were really part of the medium's unconscious life. Flournoy wrote a book called From India to the Planet Mars, and it was about the fantastic scenes of life that his subject, her name was Catherine Elise Müller, she's in Switzerland. She could create fantastic scenes of life first of all, in 14th century India, and come up with all kinds of detail about what life was like in 14th century India, though she apparently she was not a scholar of this sort of thing. And then she could come up with fantastic scenes of life and even the language spoken on the planet Mars, right? Well, this was at a time when it was not unthinkable that something like intelligent human life could exist on Mars. We now know it does not. Right? So Flournoy was able to demonstrate that much of this material came out of things that she had actually encountered in her life, but had forgotten that she knew. And Jung was influenced by Flournoy, as I mentioned, and he gave a similar explanation in his study of Helen Preisswerk, his cousin, who exhibited little less in the way of extraordinary knowledge. But the unconscious, he said, could take in far more than the conscious mind. So that's an advance. I mean, that's a move towards Myers's view of the subliminal. The unconscious has a much greater field than we know. But Jung, at that stage, did not take this as evidence of spirits. He saw the incarnations, the personalities that she would take on as, Victoria used the term modal, as dramatized split-offs from her own normal ego. Flournoy, however, he did acknowledge that there were cases in which he had no idea how the information might have been acquired in the medium's life, and he admitted the possibility that the ultimate source could sometimes be beyond the medium's mind, from something outside of it. In principle, he accepted the existence of telepathy, clairvoyance, and telekinesis. And as for the spiritualist notion of returning spirits, he didn't dismiss it as disproven, but his sense after many of these investigations was that it was improbable, that for him it was an immature conception of an afterlife, partly because it was what these spirits would communicate was too bound by our everyday notions of space and time, too much like our own existence. On the other hand, he viewed himself as a Christian, and he accepted the possibility of some form of indefinable eternal life beyond space and time, but not one that was proven by empirical evidence. Now, so they remained skeptics, but there were very sophisticated investigators among them who started out as skeptical, highly skeptical, but ended up feeling that the spiritualists were right, at least in some instances. A man named Richard Hodgson, for example, began his work with a fervent effort to expose fraud, and he found a great deal of it. Spiritualism, that world was rife with fraud. He looked for natural explanations and disputed supernaturally oriented findings on that some of his fellow investigators took seriously. Eventually, however, he decided that some of these appearances were, in fact, what the spiritualists took them to be, communications from still extant departed spirits. At least two other initially skeptical, highly scientific investigators in this crew, I have in mind two physicists by the name of William Crookes and William Barrett, came to the same conclusion. And Myers, of course, agreed. He thought that the best evidence that some of these cases did indicate survival was when a medium assumed the identity of somebody who had recently deceased, but was known to some of the sitters, some of the other people in the room. Go back to my friend Leonora Piper. She, at one point in her career, just seemed to take on a presence that announced himself as GP. GP was the personality, it seemed, of a man named George Pelham, who had not been known by Leonora Piper, but who had been known by these other investigators. He was a British person who was in their circle of acquaintance. And according to them, Mrs. Piper's GP exhibited striking private memories and personal characteristics of the original George Pelham. So Myers believed that he had, by direct observation, proven what he called the ancient hypothesis of an indwelling soul. Now come back to my mentor and guiding light in these discussions, and that's William James. He wasn't ready to acknowledge that these things, that spirits were proven by direct observations. He was willing to see that as a possible explanation, but he didn't see it as proven. And to explain the supernormal knowledge of Mrs. Piper, he was inclined to turn more towards explanation of like telepathy from living people, from their unconscious. So other people in the room knew George Pelham, consciously or unconsciously, there could be some kind of telepathic communication between them and Leonore Piper. Or, and this is another order of explanation, maybe they're picking it up from what our contemporary friend these days, Irvin Laszlo, would call the Akashic records, some kind of a reservoir of common consciousness, which James believed in and recognized at the time. Well before, I might note, Carl Jung spoke so extensively of the common consciousness. James had counter-arguments in his mind, and one of them was the triviality of the information that would seem to come through these spirits. And if you had a chance to meet your long-lost wife, would you really be focused on the fact that she had changed the place of your picture in the living room? They didn't have much to say about the other realms in which they purportedly existed. And some of these control figures he thought had every appearance of being a fictitious kind of being, a sort of composite personality. For example, he observed that Mrs. Piper, one of her controls was a personality by the name of Finuit, who purported to have been a French doctor in his earthly life, but he knew very little French, though he said a lot of other things that were interesting and detailed. In any case, James was struggling with this, and he was an admirer of a man named Gustav Fechner, who thought that our memories sort of persisted in some kind of a pool of memory that living people can have access to. But that was something different from the persistence of individual personalities. However, at the end of his life, near the end of his life, James experienced one series of seances that gave him pause. And that was the case of Richard Hodgson. I mentioned him a little earlier as one of these investigators. He died, and he apparently came back as a presence to Leonore Piper. James got fascinated with this, and he actually documented 69 cases of Hodgson's, of Leonore Piper embodying Richard Hodgson, and came to the notion that for a few of these cases, the idea of an actual visiting spirit was more plausible than any other explanation he could come up with. And I think it bears mention that much later in his life, Carl Jung said something similar. He said, although he remains skeptical in any individual instance, in the long run, these are his words, I have to admit that the spirit hypothesis yields better results in practice than any other. So James wrote a article right near the end of his life called Confessions of a Psychic Researcher. And basically his conclusion was, I don't know what the hell's going on, but something important is going on here, and subsequent generations have to keep looking into it. He thought they would, and it turns out he was somewhat optimistic about that, and I'll just close with these comments. He saw Myers's model of the subliminal mind as extraordinarily important. One of those, these are James's words, one of those sweeping ideas by which the scientific researches of an entire generation were often molded. For half a century now, he said, psychologists have fully admitted the existence of a subliminal mental region, but they have never definitely taken up the question of the extent of this region, never sought explicitly to map it out. Myers definitely attacks this problem, which after him, it will be impossible to ignore. Those were James's words. And he said this, what is the precise constitution of the subliminal? Well, that, he said, deserves to be called the problem of Myers. But actually, for a century, Myers's work was pretty well forgotten. And why? Well, I would say because of the materialistic turn that psychology as a profession took. It came to trying to establish itself as a science. It became more and more materialistic. Behaviorism held sway, and even in the field of depth psychology, we were with the Freudian view quite far from the subconscious of Myers. However, in the mid-20th century, late, well, 1960s, we have the rise of the field of transpersonal psychology with figures such as Stanislav Grof and Ken Wilber and others. And that has given, along with the evidence emerging from reincarnation experiences, near-death experience, and so forth, a new impetus to Frederick Myers's psychology. I've actually written an article on this book that goes into Myers's history and some of the recent work that's reviving Myers. The article is called, it's in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and it's called The Resurrection of Frederick Myers. If any of you are interested in that, just send me an email and I'll send you a copy. I think my email is accessible, Dan, but in any case, you can write me at mark.ryan at AYA, that is, .yale.edu. Let me leave you with these words of William James. In a eulogy right after Myers' death, James predicted that Myers will always be remembered in psychology as the pioneer who staked out a vast tract of mental wilderness and planted the flag of genuine science upon it. In the 20th century, that prediction didn't seem to hold true, but my man William James was a clever guy, and it just may be that as we see this work of Myers being revived, his prediction about Frederick Myers might still come to pass. thank you for bearing with me. Our hour is up, and I wish you the best. Much appreciation. Bye-bye.